A boy was sleeping one wall away from his mother when someone beat her to death. He was 7 years old. The bedroom next to his, her bedroom, would be found with blood on the floor, the walls, the ceiling, more than 30 wounds to her head, and face of violence so concentrated that the mattress beneath her was soaked through. And the boy did not wake up. Not through the attack, not through what his father described as a fight with an intruder on the stairs, not through any of it. In the morning, the boy was untouched, still in his bed, a few steps from the worst thing that had ever happened in his house. Hold on to that boy. He is going to matter more than almost anything else in this case. And for 50 years, almost nobody stopped long enough to ask the right question about him, which is not what he heard, but why he was still alive. His father's name was Sam Shepard, and he was an osteopathic surgeon, a respected one with a good practice, and a life that looked from the outside like the American suburb at its most comfortable. The house sat on the shore of Lake Erie, in a quiet, wealthy community called Bay Village, just outside Cleveland. There was a door on the lakeside that the family never locked. Keep that door in mind, too. On that night, the Shepards had friends over for dinner, a couple from the neighborhood. They watched a movie on television. The guests left around midnight. Sam says he fell asleep on the downstairs couch. His wife, Marilyn, 31 years old, 4 months pregnant with their second child, went upstairs to bed alone. Somewhere between that moment and 4 in the morning, someone walked into her bedroom and killed her with something heavy over and over until she was gone. Sam's account of what happened next is this. He heard Marilyn scream. He ran upstairs. He saw a form in the dark, tall, bushy-haired, he could not make out the face, standing over the bed. The form struck him, and he lost consciousness. When he came to, the form was gone, and Marilyn was dead. He heard a noise downstairs, ran down, chased the figure out toward the lake, grappled with it on the beach, and was knocked out a second time. He woke up on the shore, wet from the waist down, stumbled back to the house, and called his neighbor Spencer Houck, who also happened to be the mayor of Bay Village. "Get over here quick," he said. "I think they've killed Marilyn. I should be straight about how that story sounds, because being honest about that is part of the job. It sounds very hard to believe. A man knocked unconscious twice in one night and left alive both times, while his pregnant wife a few feet away was beaten beyond recognition. Most people who hear that hear an invention, and that reaction is not unreasonable. But what happened next is the story of a city that mistook a reasonable suspicion for a proven fact, and then spent a decade defending the mistake. Before I take you into that machine, let me give you Marilyn, because she's been swallowed by it for 70 years, and she deserves better. She was 31. She was 4 months pregnant. She had a 7-year-old son who was the center of her life. By the accounts of friends and neighbors, she was warm, social, well-liked, the person who held the household together while her husband worked long hours at the hospital. She is not the blood on the walls. She is not the case file. She was a woman who went to bed in her own house in her own country in the middle of a holiday weekend and did not wake up. Whatever else this case becomes, she is the thing at the center of it. Now, within days of Marilyn's death, one man decided he already knew the answer, and he had the largest printing press in the city to say it with. His name was Louis Seltzer, and he was the editor of the Cleveland Press. Seltzer did not wait for the investigation. He ran editorials demanding action, naming Sam as the obvious suspect, and building day after day a case on the front page that the police had not yet built in the evidence room. The headlines were not questions. They were verdicts with question marks stapled to the end, Why isn't Sam Shepard in jail? And here I have to pull myself up, because if I only tell you about the newspaper, I'm doing the same thing the newspaper did, building toward a conclusion with one hand on the scale. Sam Shepard gave the police real reasons to doubt him, and I owe you that. He had been having an affair with a young medical technician named Susan Hayes, and when detectives asked him about it point blank in the first days, he lied. He denied it, and he was caught. That lie did not make him a murderer, but it made him a liar at exactly the moment when his credibility was the only thing between him and a cell. And it gave every suspicious mind in Cleveland the confirmation it was already reaching for. The trial was less a proceeding than a public event. Reporters sat inside the bar of the court so close to the jury they could have passed them notes. The gallery was packed. The city had already decided, and the courtroom simply ratified the decision. There is a claim reported by the journalist Dorothy Kilgallen, who covered the trial and was a serious reporter, that the presiding judge, Edward Blythen, told her privately before the verdict that Sam was guilty as hell. Blythen was dead by the time Kilgallen made the claim public, so he could never confirm or deny it. I give it to you as a credible report, not as a proven fact. But the atmosphere it describes a court where the conclusion arrived before the evidence that part is in the record and not in dispute. Sam Shepard was convicted of second-degree murder. He spent 10 years in prison. And then the Supreme Court of the United States did something it rarely does. In Shepard v. Maxwell, the court ruled that the trial had been so infected by pre-trial publicity, the headlines, the editorials, the carnival in the courtroom, that Sam Shepard had never received a fair trial at all. It threw the conviction out. In a second trial, defended by a young attorney named F. Lee Bailey, Sam was acquitted. Acquittal is not the same thing as answers. Sam walked out of prison a free man and a ruined one. He drank, he married badly, he lost his medical license, and in a detail that sounds invented but is not spent his last years as a professional wrestler under a stage name. He died in 1970 at 46. The case had eaten him alive, and here is the door that should have been opened in the first week and was never opened until the man behind it was already dead. His name was Richard Eberling, and he was the window washer at the Shepard house. He knew the home. He knew the layout. He had been inside many times by invitation. In the early days after the murder, Eberling was questioned because he had Marilyn Shepard's blood on a watch and personal effects. He told the police he had cut himself while working at the house. They accepted this. They moved on. They moved on because they already had their man. The newspaper had named him The City had agreed, and a window washer with a plausible story about a cut hand was simply not dramatic enough to compete. Years later, Richard Eberling was convicted of murdering an elderly woman named Ethel May Durkin, beaten to death in her own home, a home where Eberling had worked as a handyman. He died in prison in 1998. And in the 1990s, DNA testing, pursued doggedly by Sam's son, Sam Reese Shepard, who had spent his adult life trying to clear his father, pointed toward Eberling as a possible source of biological evidence at the original crime scene. And now I have to do for Eberling exactly what I should do for every suspect in every case, be fair. The DNA was suggestive, not conclusive. A civil trial in 2000, brought by Sam's son to formally establish wrongful imprisonment, ended in a verdict against him. The jury found the evidence insufficient. If I tell you Eberling did it, I am doing the same thing the Cleveland Press did in 1954, replacing uncertainty with certainty, because certainty feels cleaner. I will not do that. What I will tell you is the shape. A man who had the victim's blood on his things, who knew the house well enough to walk through it in the dark, who had a later conviction for beating a woman to death in a home where he worked, who was questioned once, believed once, and never seriously pursued, not because the evidence against him was weak, but because the evidence against Sam Shepard was loud. Loud enough to fill a front page, loud enough to fill a courtroom, loud enough that a surgeon spent a decade in prison, lost his career, lost his family, lost his health, and died at 46. And the question of who actually killed Marilyn Shepard is still officially open. Now come back to the boy and the door. The 7-year-old who slept through it all, unhurt, one wall from the carnage. And the door on the lakeside that was never locked. A stranger breaking in to rob the place has no reason to leave the child a witness, a noise, a problem. A husband killing his wife in fury has a child in the next room to deal with, whether he thinks about it or not. But someone who came for Marilyn, specifically, who knew the house because he had worked in it, who walked in through a door he already knew was open, and went to the one room he needed, and left everything else untouched, that person might do exactly what happened. Kill her, and leave the boy sleeping where he was. That is not proof. It is a shape. And it was a shape that was visible from the first morning, but nobody was looking at shapes, because the whole city was too busy being sure. It would be easy to hear that and think, well, that was the 50s. One aggressive editor in one mid-size American city, a cruder era, a louder press, a system that didn't know any better. It couldn't happen the same way today. So let me take you somewhere later, and smaller, and worse. A place with no seltzer, no printing press, no editor driving the story from the outside. A place where the certainty that buried the case did not come from any newsroom. It came from inside, from the gut of an entire community, from a fear so deep that when 3 children were found dead, the town already knew what kind of evil had done it. Not because the evidence pointed there, because the fear did. Every kid in the neighborhood knew those woods. They were a scrap of trees and muddy ground along a drainage canal at the edge of town behind the truck stop, and the interstate, the kind of place children claimed as their own because no adult had any use for it. They called it Robin Hood Hills. They rode their bikes there after school, splashed in the ditch, built things broke. Things did what 8-year-olds do when the weather is warm and the afternoon is long and nobody is watching. 3 of them rode in on a May afternoon and did not come home for dinner. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, all of them 8 years old. By nightfall their parents were searching, and by the next afternoon, searchers found them in the water of the drainage ditch, stripped, bound with their own shoelaces, submerged in the mud. I want to stay here for one moment before anything else happens, because what follows is going to be loud and ugly and political, and it would be very easy to lose these 3 boys inside it. Stevie was 8, a small, quiet kid who followed where his friends led, and was happiest on his bike. Michael was 8, the one with the energy, the one who always had a plan for the afternoon. Christopher was 8, loud, restless, the kind of boy teachers remember equally for his trouble and his grin. They were 2nd graders with bikes and mothers and homework they probably hadn't done, and the ordinary, beautiful chaos of being small boys in a small Arkansas town. They are not the case file. They are not the legal argument. They are 3 children who rode into a familiar place on a familiar afternoon and were killed there by someone who, to this day, has never been held to account for any of it. That is the center of this. Everything else is what happened around it. Now, the condition of the bodies. I am going to handle this as carefully as I can, because a single piece of interpretation at this crime scene is the hinge on which the entire case turned, and it turned the wrong way. The initial examination found injuries on the boys, most notably on Christopher Byers, that the investigators, guided by a man who presented himself as an expert in occult crimes, read as ritualistic, deliberate, satanic. That reading landed on soil that was ready for it. This was the American South in 1993, deep in the Bible Belt, at the tail end of a national panic over satanic ritual abuse that had already produced false accusations and wrongful convictions across the country. The word satanic did not need evidence to travel. It needed only to be spoken. And here, I have to be straight about that reading because the honest sources challenge it directly, and the challenge matters. Forensic experts who reviewed the evidence years later, including analysis prepared for the appeals, argued that the injuries read as deliberate cuts were more consistent with post-mortem animal activity. Turtles fish, the ordinary scavengers of a shallow ditch. I am not telling you the later analysis is certainly right. I am telling you the question is real, it is serious, it was raised by credentialed professionals, and in 1993 in West Memphis. Nobody asked it. By then the town already had its answer. They found it fast. Within weeks, 3 teenagers were in custody: Damien Echols, 18, Jason Baldwin, 16, Jesse Miskelly, Jr., 17. And understanding why these 3 and not anyone else is understanding the whole case, because the reason was not evidence. The reason was appearance. Damien Echols wore black. He listened to Metallica. He read Stephen King and books on Wicca. He had a troubled background psychiatric care, minor run-ins, and he made no attempt to blend in. In West Memphis, Arkansas, in the spring of 1993, with 3 dead children and a town vibrating with fear, Damien Echols did not need to be connected to the crime by evidence. He needed only to look like what the community was already afraid of. Jason Baldwin was his closest friend. Jesse Miskelly was a loose acquaintance on the edge of the group, and the man who tied them to the occult reading of the crime scene, a crucial link in the prosecution's logic, was a figure worth pausing on. His name was Dale Griffiths, and he testified as an expert in occult killings. His doctoral degree at Emerged came from a correspondence school that was not accredited. His expertise amounted to having read about the subject and lectured on it to police departments. The court allowed him to testify anyway. A man with a mail-order credential stood in front of a jury and told them with confidence that these murders bore the marks of satanic ritual, and in a town that already believed it, his confidence was more than enough. There was no physical evidence tying any of the 3 to Robin Hood Hills. No blood, no hair, no fiber, no footprint, no witness who placed them there. What the police had was a profile and a confession, and the confession is the darkest piece of this story. Jesse Miskelly was brought in for questioning and interrogated for a stretch of roughly 12 hours. He was 17, with a recorded IQ of 72, questioned without a parent or lawyer for the vast majority of that time. Of those hours, approximately 46 minutes were recorded. The rest was not. What emerged was a confession that was vivid and detailed and wrong. He placed the killings at a time of day the evidence contradicted. He described details that did not match the scene. He got basic facts incorrect. He recanted almost immediately, then confessed again, then recanted again. I know the question you are asking because it is the right question. Why would an innocent person confess to a triple murder of children? I will not wave that away. But I will tell you plainly that false confessions are not rare and not mysterious. They are extensively documented, particularly among subjects with intellectual disabilities under prolonged interrogation pressure, and the research on this is deep enough that I am comfortable stating it as established science. I will also not tell you that Miss Kelly's confession was certainly false, because I was not in the room, and the 12 hours that were not recorded are 12 hours I cannot account for. What I will say is this: the confession was the strongest evidence the prosecution ever produced, and it was riddled with factual errors. Let that sit where it sits. The jury convicted all three. Damien Echols was sentenced to death. Jason Baldwin and Jessie Miskelly received life in prison without parole. 3 teenagers convicted in a courtroom inside a community that had known its verdict before the foreman read it, and for 18 years the case was closed. It did not stay closed. In 1996, a documentary crew from HBO released a film called Paradise Lost that laid the case open for a national audience. The threadbare evidence, the coerced confession, the teenagers who did not fit and were made to pay for it. More films followed. Celebrities took up the cause. Lawyers worked pro bono for years. And then in 2007, the tools that did not exist in 1993 delivered something the original investigation never had: DNA results from the crime scene. The results excluded all 3 convicted men. Not a trace of Echols, Baldwin, or Miskelly at the scene where 3 boys had been bound and killed. And here is the detail I need you to sit with, because it is the quietest and maybe the most important thing in this entire case. What the DNA did find was a hair caught in one of the ligatures used to bind the victims that was consistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch. Hobbs was among the parents searching for the boys that night. He lived in the same house as one of the victims, and in 1993 he was barely questioned. Not because the evidence pointed away from him. There was no evidence pointing anywhere yet. He simply was not considered because, by the second week of the investigation, the police had 3 teenagers in black t-shirts, and a stepfather in the victim's own household was not interesting enough to look at. And I must be as careful with Hobbs as I have been with everyone else in this story, because if this whole episode is about the damage certainty does, I will not hand you a new certainty and call it justice. A hair consistent with Hobbs is not a conviction. Mitochondrial DNA establishes a possible match, not a definitive one, and a man living in the same house as the victim has innocent explanations for how his hair ended up on the child's clothing. There are domestic violence allegations in Hobbs's record, and they are real, and they are not proof of murder. He has never been charged. He has never been tried. I owe him that sentence. What I do not owe anyone is silence about the shape. A man who lived with the victim, whose genetic material appeared in the bindings, who had a documented history of violence in the home, and who was never seriously investigated, not because he was cleared, but because the investigation had already filled itself with a different answer, and there was simply no room for one more. In 2011, all 3 men walked out of prison through a mechanism called an Alford plea. They maintained their innocence, while the state maintained it had sufficient evidence to convict. Echols had spent 18 years on death row. 18 years. They were free but not exonerated, carrying a legal status that says you are not guilty and we are not sorry in the same breath. And Stevie and Michael and Christopher are still in the ground, and the person who put them there has never been named. The certainty of a frightened town spent 18 years on the wrong answer, and when the certainty collapsed, there was nothing left to build with. The witnesses had aged, the memories had blurred, the ditch had been filled in. The town moved on. The case did not. Johnson here, one quick pause before the last case, because it is the one that has been sitting with me the longest. If these longer, slower cases are worth something to you, subscribing and tapping the bell genuinely helps them get made. And if there's a case you want me to look at, the comments are where I'll find it. Now let me set this last one up properly. Because so far we have watched certainty bury a case twice, and both times the certainty was singular, one answer, one direction, one name that drowned out the rest. In Cleveland, the name came from a newsroom. In West Memphis, it came from a community sphere. But both times the certainty pointed one way. The last case asks what happens when certainty doesn't point one way, but every way when not one man, not one town, but an entire country and half the intelligence services on the planet are all completely sure all at the same time, and every single one of them is sure about something different. For that, we go to Stockholm. The most consequential decision a man made on the last day of his life was not political. He was the prime minister of his country, and on that evening he chose to go to the cinema with his wife, and to go without his bodyguards. He waved them off. He did this sometimes. He liked to walk the streets of his city the way he had always walked them before the title and the security detail and the armored cars, as an ordinary man on an ordinary Friday night. That evening someone else knew he would be unprotected. That fact, how they knew, has never been explained. His name was Olof Palme, and to understand why his murder became the longest unsolved assassination investigation in modern European history. 34 years, more than 130 suspects, tens of thousands of pages of case file. You have to understand who he was, because the answer explains why half the world had a theory, and why every theory was loud enough to drown out the others. Palme was not a quiet leader. He was the prime minister who compared American bombing campaigns in Vietnam to the atrocities of the Nazis publicly as a head of state to the fury of Washington. He was the European leader most openly hostile to South African apartheid, a supporter of the ANC, a conduit for anti-apartheid funding, a man the regime in Pretoria had reason to consider a threat. He criticized Moscow. He hosted PLO delegations. He made enemies the way a blade makes cuts in every direction and deep. I need to say this clearly before I go any further, because a long list of enemies is a short step from a conspiracy theory, and I do not traffic in those. A man having powerful enemies does not mean any particular enemy killed him. What the list does explain is why the investigation that followed was pulled in so many directions at once that it could never gather itself into one, and why that more than any missing clue is what killed the case. On a Friday evening in late February, Palm and his wife Lisbeth decided on short notice to go see a film at the Grand Cinema on Sveavägen, one of the main streets of central Stockholm. The decision to go was made late, almost casually. Their son had mentioned the film, and the Palms had decided to join. They took the subway like ordinary passengers. They sat in the dark among ordinary people. Nobody bothered them. They walked home afterward, the two of them, up the wide pavement through the cold. At 23 minutes past 11, a man stepped up behind them on the sidewalk, raised a revolver, and fired once into Palm's back at close range. Palm collapsed and died almost immediately. A second shot grazed Lisbeth's coat. The shooter turned and ran up the steep steps of Tunnelgaten, a narrow side street climbing the hill behind them, and vanished into the dark. He was gone in seconds, and here is where the first certainty, the innocent one, the one that was supposed to help, did its damage. I should be careful about the exact timeline, because the sources give different accounts of precisely how many minutes passed before the first meaningful police response. What is not in dispute is the larger picture. The initial reaction was dangerously slow, and the reason was disbelief. The officers who took the first calls could not process what they were hearing. A prime minister shot dead on a public street in Stockholm, it did not fit. It did not compute. Sweden was not that kind of country. That certainty this does not happen. Here bought the killer a window of time that no amount of investigation would ever recover. What followed was the longest, most expensive, most exhaustively resourced murder investigation in Scandinavian history, and it produced not one wrong answer, but a chorus of them, each one backed by someone with absolute confidence, each one consuming years and resources that the others needed. The first belonged to Hans Holmér, the Stockholm police chief, who took personal command of the case. Holmér was convinced it was the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, which had a presence in Stockholm. He launched a massive operation, detained Kurdish residents, built his case with public swagger and total certainty. He was wrong. The evidence did not hold. The detentions produced nothing. Holmér was eventually forced off the case, but by then months of investigative momentum had been poured into a theory that ended in a wall. The second came from the intelligence world. South Africa's security apparatus had monitored Palm for years. After his death stories surfaced about something called Operation Long Reach, an alleged program to deal with foreign leaders who threatened the apartheid state. Former operatives gave interviews. Authors wrote books. The theory had the shape of a spy thriller, the weight of genuine geopolitical motive, and the appeal of a grand explanation. What it did not have was any direct evidence placing a South African agent on Sveavägen that night. The third arrived with a name and a face, Christer Pettersson, a petty criminal and drug user identified by Lisbeth Palm in a police lineup. He was tried and convicted in 1989, and for a brief, strange moment, Sweden exhaled. They had their man. Then the appeals court took the conviction apart. The lineup procedure had been flawed. Lisbeth may have seen photographs of Pettersson before the identification contaminating the process. Her account was the sole direct link between Pettersson and the crime, and the court was not satisfied it was clean. He was acquitted. Pettersson spent the rest of his life in and out of tabloid headlines, occasionally hinting at involvement in interviews that seemed designed to sell papers rather than deliver truth, and died in 2004 without the case being any clearer than the night the shots were fired. The closest thing Sweden ever had to an answer turned out to be another dead end, and the years spent convicting and then unconvicting him were years the investigation could not recover. And then there was the so-called police trail, a theory that elements within the Swedish police with far-right sympathies and access to weapons may have been involved. Guns had gone missing from police arsenals. Officers with ties to extremist circles had surfaced in the investigation. This theory, too, had internal logic. This theory, too, could not be proven, and this is the mechanism I want to name because it is different from everything that came before. In Cleveland, one loud certainty silenced the evidence. In West Memphis, one deep fear replaced it. In Stockholm, the evidence was not silenced or replaced, it was drowned. Drowned in a flood of theories, each one backed by people with credentials and confidence, each one commanding resources and attention, each one certain enough to crowd out the others. The investigation did not fail because nobody was looking. It failed because everyone was looking each in a different direction with total conviction, and the noise of all that conviction was louder than any single truth could possibly be. 34 years after the murder, in June of 2020, a prosecutor named Christer Peterson stood before the press and said a name, Stig Engström. A graphic designer at the Skandia Insurance Company, whose offices looked out over the intersection where Palm was shot. A man who had been among the very first people at the scene that night, who had given statements to the police that shifted and contradicted over time who owned firearms, and who held far-right political views that would have given him plenty of reason to despise the most left-leaning prime minister in Swedish history. Engström had taken his own life in the year 2000. The case was formally closed. And what closed means in this context is worth sitting with for a moment. It does not mean solved. It means that the Swedish state, after 34 years, decided it had taken the investigation as far as it could go, pointed at the most likely name among 130, and stopped. For the people of Sweden, a country that had carried this wound as a kind of national open question, the way Americans carry the Kennedy assassination, the closure was less a relief than a deflation. There was no trial, no conviction, no certainty that would survive cross-examination. Just a name spoken into a microphone attached to a man who could no longer defend himself or be convicted. And I will not dress that up as an answer because the prosecutor himself did not. He said most likely. He said that had Engström been alive, the evidence might not have been enough to take to trial. He was not solving the case. He was closing a file. And there is an irony at the bottom of this that I think is the sharpest thing in the whole affair. Stig Engström was in the investigation from the first night. He was at the scene. He gave a statement. His name was in the system before any of the grand theories, before the PKK, before South Africa, before the rogue police. But for 34 years, while the investigation chased separatist cells and foreign intelligence services and convicted addicts and secret networks, a graphic designer who worked a short walk from the murder site and whose story had never quite added up, was simply not big enough to hold anyone's attention. Now come back to the bodyguards. Palm turned them away that evening, a late decision reportedly made on the day itself. The number of people who could have known he was unprotected was small. And the killer approached from behind at point-blank range with a confidence that does not belong to someone guessing. That confidence implies knowledge the shooter knew there would be no one between him and the target. How he knew that who told him, or how he found out, is a question that would have narrowed the field dramatically. It was never answered because every investigator who might have pulled that thread was too busy pulling a different one. The one they were certain about. 130 suspects, a dozen competing theories, 34 years. And the answer, if it is the answer, may have been standing at the crime scene from the very first night, giving his statement to a detective who wrote it down and filed it away because there were bigger names to chase, bigger certainties to serve, and a man no one had heard of was simply not what anyone was looking for. So, a surgeon's wife in Ohio, 3 boys in a drainage ditch in Arkansas, a prime minister on a sidewalk in Stockholm. Different decades, different countries, different worlds, but set them side by side, and the same shape rises out of all 3. In each one, someone decided they knew the answer before the evidence could finish speaking. In each one, that certainty was not a whisper, it was the loudest thing in the room. A newspaper that convicted a man before his trial. A town that found its devils before it found its proof. A nation that chased so many answers it could never hear any one of them clearly. We like to think the truth is what we find when we look hard enough. These 3 cases say something harder. The truth is what we stop finding the moment we decide we've already found it. Not because we're lazy, and not because we're corrupt, but because we're certain. And certainty is the quietest, most natural, most human way to close a door that should have stayed open. The evidence in each of these cases pointed somewhere. Whether it pointed at the window washer, or the stepfather, or the graphic designer, I cannot tell you with certainty, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I can tell you this: the reason we may never know is not that the clues were missing. It is that nobody was looking at them. They were all too busy being sure. Marilyn Shepard, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, Olaf Palm. 5 people. No answers. The least the rest of us can do is keep the question open and be very careful about the moment we think we've closed it. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with the hard ones. I'll see you on the next.